All right, welcome everybody. Big pleasure, sunny Johannesburg. It seems to be winter here, but we are not believing in it, but that's it. It's actually August. My name is Bartosz Szpiech. I'm Vice President of Product Development in XPlus, owning the Executive Automats brand. And today, that's the special day for me because finally I've got a big occasion to talk with Monray Williams, the auditor for SOX compliance, working in industry for 30 years, for the last 17 years, been focusing mostly on IT industry and the compliance. So big pleasure. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving the time for us and doing the interview. It will be more than fun to learn and more than fun to share the knowledge with community that finance and operations can actually be SOX compliance. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you. Great being here and thanks for having me.
So if we can start like a basics, can you tell us like for a newbie, for a person who starts, what is the SOX compliance about? Because we talk about back and forth on different projects together, and we see that this is not only a ERP system, it's kind of a bigger chunk in the organization.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand where SOX came from. The whole principle of SOX, or the Sarbanes-Oxley Act as it's called in the USA, came about after some corruption globally, and especially after Enron and the Lehman Brothers issues in the US, where certain of the internal controls obviously failed, and the SEC then felt it appropriate to set up a set of regulations for the companies that's listed on the New York Stock Exchange to ensure that good governance and internal controls are in place for organizations. That entailed a number of different sections, some based more on the transactional operations and controls related to that, but others then more focused at the entity level controls that's required to run an organization. I think the important things to remember is that what they've done is to put the focus and the emphasis on management ensuring that controls are in place and that they can certify that the controls are operating effectively. The auditors would then come and give an independent opinion on the operating effectiveness of the controls and management's processes related to that, but the focus is management has to attest to the effective operating of those controls. Those controls would then relate obviously to material processes across the organization. And because organizations are so highly dependent on information technology, it typically relates to a number of their applications and supporting systems as well. So in general, your typical ERP systems or your HR systems would in most cases be in scope for SOX purposes and therefore require adequate automated or manual IT dependent controls that relates to those environments.
Perfect. Thanks so much for walking through that element. So we can say that there is a multiple things to be included, and SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, in that example, but probably also LSE and other stock markets across the globe. You've mentioned also Johannesburg Exchange. Everybody has different regulations, and this is not only that it applies towards United States. It is formalized and well known there, but the other stock markets, they have their own specifics. Yeah.
Definitely, the most of the other markets followed the US like they typically do. We found JSOX being implemented. We find a European version of that. I think there's also a French version. Locally in South Africa, the JSE has introduced similar measures, maybe not as harsh and strict as the US, but certainly following the trend. And locally we refer to it as the financial reporting controls or internal financial reporting controls that companies have to attest to.
And that's perfect because that actually tells us that this is the trend, that the market needs to adjust, that ERP systems needs to be ready to allow users to make that automatic controls mitigation, to implement a lot of functionalities to support that efficiency and the security which is required by the stock market. I know that when we worked with one of the biggest implementation of finance and operations so far, noticed on the Southern Hemisphere, we've been able to define some functionalities which are actually needed from the system perspective. Definitely to confirm, if I'm not mistaken, like segregation of duties is just a tip of the iceberg. There are multiple other controls. Can we try to name what else is needed strictly from ERP system to make it compliant?
Yeah, I think very important. There's a couple of basics required from a system perspective. And let's start with the obvious ones. Access control and appropriate limitations as far as the rights and the access people have to applications. The change control process surrounding the changes that's made to the specific application, and ensuring that only authorized and tested changes are implemented in the system. Because if those aren't in place, you can have unauthorized access to the system and therefore unauthorized financial transactions. You can always sit with a scenario where untested changes or changes that weren't tested thoroughly were implemented in the system and therefore have a direct implication on the financial output out of the system. So these two core components, being change control and access control, critical. On the access control side, obviously segregation of duty then forms part of how you enable and how you support your processes by ensuring that people can't process conflicting transactions or have conflicting duties within the business process. On the change control side, you specifically sit with things like privileged access that may be required to make certain changes, and then the control around emergency changes within your system. The processes to accommodate that differ from ERP to ERP. Historically, SAP has taken the lead and via the correction and transport system and the GRC platform have catered very much for the facilitation, if I can call it that, to be SOX compliant. We're seeing more and more that the pressure are on other ERPs to implement similar measures, but we've also seen the development of an industry around providing the functionality where ERP systems actually don't have that native capability to help enforce and measure and monitor the control compliance, resulting in several companies developing products that either helps you with data tracking or with segregation of duty, or just checking for critical transaction access. And these companies then supplement some of the bigger ERPs that may not have the functionality to assist in enforcing all the control measures required to be, for example, SOX compliant.
That's perfect. So from the ground zero, when you implement the system to make it compliant, what is the range of the time from your experience? How much time you have to foresee in the implementation process to start to go live with actually being compliant? It is actually something which is done within the implementation process, or this is far, far beyond that you have time, you can implement your system and then include those measurements?
I think that is a brilliant question, because companies generally underestimate when they have to be compliant. So if we look at the typical implementation, customers seem to think that they can go live, go through what we typically call the intensive care period, and then they have to be compliant. But the actual fact, it's the reverse. The moment that you go live, you have to be compliant. So what we typically find in implementations, people go live, they don't implement the controls immediately, and halfway into the year, the auditors come in and say, but you have a problem, because as auditors, they look at the year under review, and if the control wasn't functioning for the full year, they then go back and say, but we can't rely on the system because your controls only kicked in halfway, or you actually haven't even started enforcing the controls, and therefore we can't rely on your application. So why I said your question is so relevant. If people don't plan for implementing their controls as part of the design of the system, and it forms part of your system development life cycle, what you then find is that for the first year they're not compliant, and then the pressure on them while they're still adapting to a new ERP actually incrementally increases, because they've got to now implement controls, learn the new system, and run their business.
And that's dangerous.
and that's got a material impact on what happens on the ground, both financially and operationally.
That's true. I think one of the lessons learned, what we've seen in the project we worked together, was that the actual implementation of the security rights and SOD compliance actually made the changes to the business processes. So sometimes business process needs to adjust to actually be transparent from the financial perspective. So that was very interesting for me to see, like, how important it is to kind of make this decision before and implement that. So if we talk about some basics, some ERP functionalities needed to be implemented and so forth. But let's talk briefly about what actually is something which the company is actually scared of. What is the penalty, or how the penalty process looks like? What the company is actually getting if they are not compliant on time?
Well, basically, if you're not compliant, and depending on the severity of the non-compliance, that gets reported through to, in the SOX case, to the SEC, and that can have different measures of penalties. But I suppose the ultimate penalty is, if your controls are in place, is what your shareholders do to you when they realize and when it's reported that your controls aren't in place. The SEC has gone further in the last year or so in actually now also requiring you to report privacy breaches and security breaches, which once again has an impact on the shareholders' attitude towards your share. Typically in the industry, people argue that the lack of control, or the reverse of that, good controls, can add up to 20% to your stock price. Now, I can't say that has been proven, but that is what experts are saying, that they believe the impact of good or bad internal control, or in general more good governance, can add to your share price. So I suppose the fear for management is that if they don't comply, is that indirect response from the market, not just the penalties that they can, and the measure that the SEC can bring up against them. It's more the market perception. I think that's the biggest thing or should be the biggest thing for management.
That's scary. I mean, 20% of a few billions might be a big chunk of your organization.
I mean, if you just look at the recent past, the impact on share prices if controls aren't working, and I'm not just talking specifically around controls relating to financial reporting. If you take the recent CrowdStrike incident, I think you and I stand to be corrected. The impact on the share price was about 11%. Mm. Now, one can debate on what went wrong, but in my mind, basically it was a control failure that resulted in them releasing an update, and that update causing what is estimated to be about $5 billion of damage in the market.
It was big.
It is. The purpose of this discussion is not to analyze it, but we've looked into it, and I certainly believe it was a failure of some of the internal controls that resulted in this update going to market.
That's interesting. Yeah, everybody was actually it was present effort from airports, military, aviation, and medicines. Yeah. So that is a perfect summary of what you can plan in implementation. What are the actually elements we have to be scared of? Some remediations. So, what are your recommendations for a company which goes on the go live soon, or they are planning to implement system? What they should do? They should work with auditor. They should do internal some planning. What would be like something that you would like to recommend to a company which is simply planning the implementation of ERP system?
I think there's 3 or 4 components. It's one, ensuring that you, as part of your design of your system and your business processes, think about your controls and your control points within your process. Because it's not something you want to engineer in at the back end. A lot of people don't do that, and then once the auditors have assessed it, and you then have to go back, sometimes you have to re-implement some parts of your process, and that is very costly. So in ensuring that your controls are part of your system development life cycle, and that your business processes have the appropriate controls built in, be it manual or automated, I think that is important. Secondly, it is then ensuring that you test those processes before going live, and also test your controls before you go live. Because as I said, once you go live, from that point, from that minute that you switch on the system, your controls should be functioning adequately. The third point that you touched on, saying working with the auditors, making sure that although your auditors can't give you an opinion on your controls until it's operating, they can certainly have a look at your opening balances, ensure that what goes into the system is independently reviewed, and then give you an opinion on the design of the controls before it goes live. You can also use your internal audit departments it doesn't have to be completely independent, to give input on the design of the controls. So there are a number of things that you can do to add and prevent you from ending up in a position where you are not compliant or don't have adequate controls in place. I suppose the last one is also in your selection of your ERP process, is ask the questions around the capabilities of your ERP system. I've seen clients, and I think the one we're referring to, that they go from a system that has certain capabilities to some system that doesn't have the same capability. And in that process, you then have some additional effort and additional systems and or tools that you require to maintain your level of compliance.
That's the perfect spot, and I think let's talk about Dynamics Finance and Operations, because that was a surprise pretty much to multiple parties of that project, that standard of finance operations on the day where implementation started had lack of multiple measurements of the controls. The SOD was not actually working so much, and I think we can agree together that segregation of duties in finance and operations was a little bit misleading, because that was not the smallest object of security in F&O, which make that whole disaster that you actually, even though you think that you've done the right choice, this is not the smallest particle, so this might be misleading. So we can definitely see that nowadays company need to buy finance and operations, search for ISV products, and then include some auditing team on the project team to actually end up with being self-compliance. So what do you think regarding finance and operations and making it compliant from the SOX perspective?
I think you've touched on two things. The one is ensuring that you're assessing the segregation of duty at the right level. And in not doing that, you result in a false positive, in the sense of you think you're compliant, but you're actually not checking at the right level for segregation of duty. I think that the second part is ensuring that you as a business have a set of rules that you can then via either the application or some supporting tools run against your processes to assess which transactions are incompatible and should not be given to the same user. A lot of companies don't have that, what we refer to as a rule set. And because you don't have a rule set, you then don't have a method to test if whatever access you are allocating to users actually creates a problem. So I suppose it's twofold for me. It's the business having the necessary rules about what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And then secondly, ensuring that you have the capability in your functionality of your ERP and or your supporting technologies to test for compliance against that. Because as we've said earlier, SOX is not a once-off thing. It's not a point-in-time thing where you're compliant today and then everything is fine. You've got to, as you change and add users, ensure that you stay compliant throughout the year, and then obviously only then with the auditors and management be able to sign off and say our controls are functioning adequately. And I think that is important for me.
That's perfect. Thank you much for the summary. So we can briefly say that you can make finance and operations SOX compliant, but you need to make some decisions what tools you want to incorporate in it to make a great base for designing perfectly the role access rights, to design perfectly the measurement controls regarding the segregation of duty, so rule set, emergency access rights, I guess also some other processes which we'll probably spend much more time to describe that, but keeping this as a baseline, we can clearly see that finance and operations is entering the market, which is for enterprise level of customers. So that is something which every system integrator would like to work with. And yeah, with such a great people as you, Monray, in the market, we are able to step up with the system to guarantee that the controls are in place and we are able to maintain the compliance state of the organization. We'll list your contact details at the end of the video, so feel free to jump in on LinkedIn of Monray or site or contact directly. We are more than happy to collaborate, look forward for more projects where we'll be able to make the finance and operations SOX compliant. And yeah, thank you so much for the time spent with us.
Thank you for having me.